Dad toasted my successful daughter while I sat there, until I bought the restaurant. The champagne flute in his hand, a crystal spear aimed at my heart, reflected the soft, expensive lights of the gilded spoon. My father, Robert, beamed, his face flushed with pride. Beside him, my older sister, Jessica, preened. She was the successful daughter, the corporate lawyer with a corner office, a six-figure salary, and a fiancé, Michael, who looked like he was carved from marble and smugness. I, on the other hand, was Emily, the graphic designer, the one with the artistic hobby that barely paid the rent on my tiny one-bedroom apartment. My father toasted my successful daughter while I sat there until I bought the restaurant. He never saw my roots spreading. Subscribe and leave a like to see how I reclaimed my life. The entire table was focused on them. Robert's voice boomed, carrying across the hushed dining room. To Jessica, he said, for her promotion to senior partner. We always knew you had it in you. Drive, ambition, a real head for business. He glanced at me for a fraction of a second, a flicker of something that might have been pity, or maybe just dismissal. Not everyone is built for the real world, but you, my dear. You were born to conquer it. Everyone raised their glasses. I lifted mine, the cheap house Prosecco they'd ordered specially for me feeling heavy and sour in my hand. Jessica had champagne, of course. Vintage. Michael put his arm around her, kissing her temple. She's incredible, he murmured, loud enough for everyone to hear. I took a sip, the bubbles stinging my throat. This was my life, a permanent spectator at the celebration of my sister. I remembered my mother, Helen, who had passed away 5 years ago. She used to see me. When I would hide in my room drawing for hours, she wouldn't call it a hobby. She'd bring me a snack and sit quietly, watching my pencil move across the paper. She once told me something I never forgot, her voice a soft anchor in the constant storm of my father's expectations. Emily, she'd said, brushing a stray hair from my face, remember that the quietest person in the room is often the most powerful. I clung to those words like a life raft. They were the only proof I had that I wasn't invisible. So, Emily, Michael said, turning to me with a practiced, condescending smile. Still drawing your little cartoons? I forced a smile back. I design logos and branding for small businesses, Michael. It's a bit more than cartoons. Right, he said, waving his hand dismissively. Jess was telling me you did a menu for a coffee shop. That's cute. Jessica jumped in, her voice dripping with false sweetness. Oh, be nice, darling. Emily is very creative. It's wonderful that she has a passion. Not everything has to be about climbing the corporate ladder, right? She squeezed my arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging in just a little. The message was clear. Stay in your lane, little sister. The slow lane. My father cleared his throat. Well, passion doesn't pay the mortgage, Robert stated, taking a large bite of his steak. Security, stability, that's what matters. That's what your sister has achieved. I stared down at my plate of pasta. It was the cheapest thing on the menu, but it still felt like an extravagance I couldn't afford. Every family dinner was like this, a performance review where I was always rated, does not meet expectations. They didn't see the late nights I spent perfecting a design, the joy on a small business owner's face when I handed them a logo that perfectly captured their dream. They only saw the numbers on a paycheck, the title on a business card. To them, my world was small and insignificant, a quaint little hobby on the sidelines of Jessica's grand, important life. Later that night, back in my apartment, the contrast was jarring. The gilded spoon had plush velvet chairs and gold leaf accents. My apartment had a wobbly kitchen table I'd found on the curb and walls with paint that was starting to peel near the window. The city lights blinked outside, but they felt a million miles away. I sat on my lumpy sofa, the silence of the room amplifying the echo of my father's toast. My successful daughter. The words played on a loop in my head. He had 2 daughters, but in that moment, in his eyes, he only had one. I looked at my hands. They weren't soft and manicured like Jessica's. They had calluses from my drawing tablet, smudges of ink under the nails. These hands built things. They created identities from scratch. They weren't made for shuffling papers in a high-rise. They were made for making something out of nothing. My mother's words came back to me, The quietest person in the room is often the most powerful. I had been quiet for too long. I had let them define me, shrink me down into a manageable, non-threatening box labeled the artistic one. I had accepted their narrative that my work was cute, that my life was less than. Tonight, something shifted. It wasn't a loud, angry snap, but a deep, silent click, like a lock finding its key. I stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the bustling street. They thought the world was a ladder you had to climb. But what if it wasn't? What if you could just build your own building right next to theirs? An idea, wild and terrifying and beautiful, began to take root in my mind. It started with a name, the Gilded Spoon, the very symbol of their world, the stage for my humiliation. I thought about its polished floors, its exclusive clientele, its owner whom my father always greeted by name. And I made a decision. I wasn't going to ask for a seat at their table anymore. I was going to buy the whole table, and the restaurant that came with it. They had no idea who I really was or what I was capable of, but they were about to find out. The decision I made by the window felt like a bolt of lightning, but the next morning, it felt like a hangover. I woke up at 6 a.m., the gray light filtering through my blinds and the weight of my ambition pressed down on me. Buying the Gilded Spoon. It sounded insane. I made coffee in my sputtering $10 machine and sat at my wobbly kitchen table, the one I'd proudly painted robin's egg blue. My laptop was open, the screen illuminating a half-finished logo for a local bakery. This was my world. Small, colorful, and held together with hope and secondhand furniture. I spent the first 2 hours doing what I do best, research. I treated the Gilded Spoon like a new client. I dug into public records, business filings, and old newspaper articles. I learned it had been owned by the same family for 40 years. Its profits, while steady, had stagnated. They weren't innovating. Their online presence was a joke, a website that looked like it was designed in 1998. My designer's eye saw a dozen things they were doing wrong. But seeing problems and having the millions of dollars to buy them were two very different things. The more I looked, the more impossible it seemed. I felt that old, familiar, shrinking sensation. The voice that sounded a lot like my father's telling me to stay in my lane. I pushed the feeling down. My mother's words echoed back to me. The quietest person in the room? I wasn't going to be quiet. I needed information that wasn't on the internet. I needed someone who understood that world. And then a name came to me. Arthur. Arthur was a client from 3 years ago, a gruff, kind man in his late 50s who owned a beloved Italian diner downtown. He'd hired me to rebrand his entire restaurant, from the menus to the sign above the door. He fought me on every single modern idea I had, but in the end, he trusted me. His business tripled within a year. He sent me a Christmas card every year without fail. He knew the city's restaurant scene inside and out. I found his number and dialed before I could lose my nerve. He answered on the second ring, his voice a familiar, gravelly rumble. Arthur's Diner. Hi, Arthur, it's Emily, the designer who did your menus a few years back. I heard a smile in his voice. Emily, of course I remember. The girl who told me my logo looked like a sad meatball. How are you? I'm good, I lied. I was wondering if I could buy you a coffee. I need some advice about the restaurant business. He paused. Everything all right? It will be, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. I just have an idea, and you're the smartest person I know in this field. We met an hour later at a small coffee shop, far from both his diner and the Gilded Spoon. Arthur listened patiently, his big, calloused hands wrapped around a ceramic mug. I told him everything. I told him about the dinner, the toast, the constant feeling of being second best. Then I told him my crazy plan. I expected him to laugh. He didn't. He just studied my face for a long moment, his expression unreadable. The Gilded Spoon, he said, tasting the words. That's a big fish, kid. A legacy spot. You'd need deep pockets. Very deep. I know it sounds impossible, I said, my voice cracking slightly. But they're stagnating, Arthur. Their brand is stale. There's an opportunity there. I can feel it. It's not about the brand, not really, he said, leaning forward. That place is an institution because of the old man who runs it. He's old school. He built it from nothing. He hates corporate vultures and private equity guys. They come sniffing around every year, offering him a fortune, and he tells them all to get lost. He cares more about who takes it over than how much they pay. A flicker of hope ignited in my chest. What do you mean? I mean, Arthur said, a slow smile spreading across his face. The owner is looking for a successor, not a buyer. He wants someone who will care about the name, about the staff, about the food. Someone with passion. He's been quietly looking for the right person for a year, but everyone who comes to him is just another suit like your sister's fiancé, talking about profit margins and downsizing. He scares them off on purpose. I stared at him, my mind racing. This was it. This was the crack in the armor. My family saw my passion as a weakness, a cute hobby. But here, in this world, it might be my greatest strength. I didn't have millions of dollars, I didn't have a business degree, but I had passion in spades. I knew how to build something with soul. So you're saying, I began, my voice barely a whisper, that the way in isn't with money? Arthur took a long sip of his coffee. I'm saying the old man doesn't want another rich suit to tear his life's work apart. He wants an artist. Someone who understands that a restaurant is a story, not just a balance sheet. He looked me straight in the eye. He's looking for someone exactly like you, Emily. He just doesn't know it yet. I walked out of that coffee shop feeling like I could breathe for the first time since that dinner. The mountain in front of me hadn't shrunk, but now I saw a path. It wasn't a wide, paved road for a corporate takeover. It was a narrow, winding trail that required something different. My father, Jessica, and Michael could never walk that path. They wouldn't even see it. But I could. It was a path made for me. My plan wasn't just possible. It was perfect. Now I just had to figure out how to get the owner's attention. Getting the owner's attention was a puzzle. I couldn't just walk into the Gilded Spoon, find the owner, and say, I know I'm a graphic designer who can barely afford your pasta, but I'd like to buy your multi-million-dollar restaurant. They'd laugh me out of the building. My father's condescending chuckle echoed in my head just thinking about it. I needed a different kind of key to open that door. A key they wouldn't expect. I spent the next 2 days locked in my apartment, surrounded by takeout containers and empty coffee mugs. The wobbly blue table was covered in sketches. The walls were plastered with notes. I was doing what I always did when faced with a problem. I was designing a solution. If I couldn't approach the owner with a briefcase full of money, I would approach him with a portfolio full of vision. I would give him something no corporate suit could, a future for his restaurant that honored its past. I decided to create a complete, unsolicited rebranding proposal. It would be the best work of my life. I started with the logo. The current one was an ornate, stuffy-looking spoon that screamed old money and older recipes. I spent hours sketching, finally landing on an elegant, simplified spoon silhouette that subtly formed the letter G. It was modern but timeless. It respected the name but gave it new life. Then came the menus. I designed them with thick, textured paper, beautiful typography, and illustrations inspired by the restaurant's history, which I pieced together from old articles. I even mocked up a new website, a digital storefront that was as classy and inviting as the restaurant itself. I created a business plan not focused on cutting costs, but on growth through experience. Themed nights, a loyalty program for regulars, a stronger community presence. I poured every ounce of my skill, every late night I'd ever spent honing my craft, into this project. It wasn't a little cartoon anymore. It was a declaration. Halfway through the second week, drowning in Pantone color swatches and financial projections I'd taught myself how to make, I hit a wall of doubt. The sheer audacity of what I was doing crashed down on me. Who was I to do this? I was Emily, the artistic one. I grabbed my phone and called Arthur. It's insane, isn't it? I asked, my voice small. He's just going to throw it in the trash. Is it good work, Emily? Arthur asked, his voice calm and steady. It's the best work I've ever done, I admitted. Then it's not insane, he said simply. Passion isn't insane. It's the most valuable currency there is in this business. By the way, the owner's name is Frank Marino. He's there every morning at 7, checking the produce delivery himself, doesn't trust anyone else to do it. That was all I needed. Knowing his name, Frank, made him real. It made the plan feel real. I thanked Arthur, hung up, and got back to work with renewed fire. I remembered my mother, Helen, watching me draw. She never saw a hobby. She saw a builder. She saw power in my quiet concentration. For the first time, I started to see it too. A week later, the proposal was finished. I had it professionally printed and bound in a simple, elegant black leather portfolio. It looked expensive. It felt important. It was the physical manifestation of my entire professional life. Holding it felt like holding a shield and a sword. That morning, I woke up at 5. I put on the nicest blazer I owned, a thrift store find, and stood in front of my mirror. The reflection that looked back wasn't the dismissed little sister from the dinner party. It was a professional. A woman with a plan. I arrived at the Gilded Spoon at 6:50. The street was quiet, the sky a soft gray. A delivery truck was parked at the curb. Just as Arthur said, an older man with a proud posture and a weary face was inspecting a crate of tomatoes. He had to be Frank. He handled a tomato with the care a jeweler would give a diamond. My heart was hammering against my ribs. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to go back to my safe, small world. I thought of Jessica's smug smile. I thought of my father's toast. I took a deep breath and walked towards him. "Mr. Marino?" I asked. My voice was steadier than I expected. He turned, his eyes sharp and appraising. He looked me up and down, taking in my cheap blazer and the nervous energy I was trying to hide. "Do I know you?" he asked, his tone flat. Not rude, but not welcoming. "No, sir. My name is Emily," I said, extending a hand. He didn't take it. "I'm a graphic designer, and I'm a great admirer of what you've built here." He grunted, turning back to his tomatoes. "I'm not looking to hire a designer." "I know," I said, stepping closer. "I'm not here for a job. I'm here because I believe in the Gilded Spoon, and I have a vision for its next 40 years. I held out the black leather portfolio. "I know your time is valuable, but if you could just take 5 minutes to look at this, that's all I ask." He stared at the portfolio, then back at my face. I could see the skepticism warring with a flicker of curiosity. He'd probably had 100 people like me approach him, all wanting something. But I wasn't just wanting. I was offering. I had built something for him. He wiped his hands on his apron, a gesture of weary resignation. "Fine," he sighed, taking the heavy portfolio from my hands. 5 minutes. He opened it right there on the hood of a car. He flipped past the first page, then the second. His gruff expression didn't change, but his hands, the way he turned the pages, slowed down. He stopped on the page with the new logo. He traced the simple, elegant lines of the G with his finger. He didn't say a word. The silence stretched on, thick with the smell of fresh bread from the kitchen and the exhaust from the truck. He kept turning the pages, his eyes scanning my designs, my words, my vision. My entire future felt like it was balancing on the edge of his silence. The 5 minutes Frank Marino promised me stretched into 10, then 15. He stood there under the gray morning sky, the portfolio resting on the hood of a dusty sedan, turning each page with a deliberate slowness. The world around us seemed to hold its breath. The delivery driver had finished and left. The city was starting to wake up, but in our small bubble of silence, the only sound was the rustle of thick paper. I tracked the movement of his eyes, the slight furrow in his brow as he studied my designs. I had poured my soul into those pages, and now a complete stranger was holding it in his hands, judging its weight. Finally, he reached the last page and closed the black leather cover with a soft thud. He didn't look at me. He stared at the cover, his finger tracing the simple gold foil of my proposed new logo. The silence was a physical weight, pressing on my chest. I was sure he was about to hand it back, maybe with a gruff, "Thanks, but no thanks," and my foolish dream would be over before it even began. "This is good work," he said, his voice low and raspy. He still wasn't looking at me. The words were so unexpected that for a second I wasn't sure I'd heard him right. "Thank you, Mr. Marino," I managed to say, my voice a little shaky. He finally lifted his head and his sharp eyes pinned me in place. This is professional work. Expensive work. A girl like you doesn't just whip this up on a whim. Who are you working for? Which private equity firm hired you to soften me up before they send in the suits? His accusation hit me like a slap. He thought I was a Trojan horse, a creative front for the very people he despised. The irony was bitter. No one, I said, my voice gaining strength from the injustice of it. No one hired me. I did this on my own time, with my own money. He scoffed, a disbelieving little sound. Right. And you just happened to pick my restaurant to pour your heart and soul into for free. Why? I took a deep breath. This was the moment. I could give him a polished business answer, or I could tell him the truth. My mother, Helen, had always valued honesty above all else. Because I had dinner here 2 weeks ago with my family, I said, my voice dropping, and my father made a toast to my sister, his successful daughter, and he looked right through me like I wasn't even there. This place, it became a symbol for me, a symbol of a world I wasn't allowed into. So I decided I wasn't going to ask for a seat at the table anymore. I was going to try and buy the whole restaurant. I expected him to laugh. Instead, he just watched me, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. He had seen 100 corporate raiders, but he had never seen this. He had never seen a motive born purely from humiliation and a desperate need to be seen. So this is about proving something to your daddy? He asked, his tone less like an accusation and more like a diagnosis. It started that way, I admitted. But then it became about this place, about its history, about what it could be. It became about the work. He nodded slowly, tapping the portfolio. You've got vision, kid. I'll give you that. You see things. But this, he waved a hand towards the restaurant's entrance. This isn't a drawing. It's not a pretty logo. It's a beast. It's 70-hour weeks. It's a plumbing leak at 3 a.m. on a Sunday. It's a chef quitting an hour before dinner service. It's sweat and burns and screaming matches over the price of fish. This business will chew up artists like you and spit them out before breakfast. His words were a cold dose of reality. I could hear my father's voice in my head, his constant refrain whenever I talked about my work. My father, Robert, always said, "Passion doesn't pay the mortgage." And for a second, my confidence wavered. Maybe they were all right. Maybe I was just a girl with a hobby, playing at being a businesswoman. You think I don't know that? I shot back, surprising myself with my own fire. I may be an artist, Mr. Marino, but I'm not naive. I know what hard work is. I've built my entire career from scratch with no help from anyone. I've worked the late nights. I've dealt with the impossible clients. I'm not afraid of sweat. A flicker of something, respect, maybe, passed through his eyes. He looked from me to the portfolio and back again. Vision is one thing, he said, more to himself than to me. Guts is another. He was quiet for another long minute. I could see a war happening behind his eyes. He was tired. Arthur was right. He was looking for a way out, but only on his own terms. I'm not going to sell you my restaurant, he said finally. My heart sank. It felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. Not yet, anyway, he continued, holding up a hand to stop my visible disappointment. A pretty book doesn't prove you can run a kitchen. It proves you can run a printer. He pointed a thick finger at my chest. You want to prove you have what it takes? You want me to even consider your crazy idea? Yes, I said, my voice a desperate whisper. More than anything. Then show me, he said, his voice a low growl. Don't tell me. Show me. Be here tomorrow at 5 a.m. Use the back entrance. You'll be on prep duty with the kitchen staff. Peeling potatoes, chopping onions, washing dishes. You'll work a full week. No pay. If you last until Saturday, we'll talk again. If you walk out before then, I'll throw this portfolio in the dumpster and you'll never hear from me again. It was an insane, impossible challenge. Me, in a professional kitchen? My hands were used to a stylus, not a chef's knife. I would be humiliated. I would probably fail, but it was a chance. It was the only door he was willing to open, even if it was the service entrance to Hell's Kitchen. I looked him straight in the eye, the image of my sister's condescending smile flashing in my mind. I thought of my mother's words. The quietest person in the room is often the most powerful. My power wasn't just in my art, it was in my resilience. I'll be here, I said, my voice clear and steady. What should I wear? For the first time, a genuine smile touched the corners of Frank Marino's mouth. Something you don't mind getting covered in garbage, he said. He tucked the black portfolio under his arm and turned, walking toward the kitchen door without another word. I was left standing alone on the sidewalk as the sun began to rise, the smell of bleach and old coffee drifting from a nearby alley. I had my chance. Now I just had to survive it. That night, I set 4 different alarms on my phone, starting at 4:15 a.m. Sleep was a distant country I couldn't visit. I just lay in bed, staring at the ceiling of my quiet, clean apartment, the scent of lavender from my diffuser filling the air. I thought about the world I was about to enter, a world of grease, noise, and sharp objects. My hands, usually stained with ink from my drawing tablet, would soon be covered in things I couldn't even imagine. My father, Robert, would have laughed himself sick if he knew. "See, Claire," I could hear him say, "I told you that art degree would land you a job washing dishes." The thought, instead of discouraging me, hardened something inside my chest. I was Claire, the artist, the quiet one. But I was about to find out if I was also a fighter. The alley behind the Gilded Spoon was even worse than I'd imagined. At 4:55 a.m., it was a canyon of overflowing dumpsters and dark, slick puddles that smelled of sour milk and old fish. I knocked on the dented steel door, my knuckles rapping against the cold metal. It swung open with a groan, and a blast of hot, humid air hit me, thick with the smell of boiling stock and bleach. A woman with a stern face and hair pulled back so tight it stretched, her eyes stood there, wiping her hands on a stained apron. She looked me up and down, from my new non-slip shoes to my nervous expression, and her lip curled. "You the art project?" she asked, her voice a low rasp. Frank Marino appeared behind her. "Cynthia, this is Claire. She's our new volunteer for the week. Show her where the potatoes are." He didn't smile. He just gave me a look that said, "Don't disappoint me," and then vanished back into the chaos. Cynthia grunted and pointed to a corner of the kitchen. "There, 100 pounds. Peel, dice, 1-inch cubes. No bigger, no smaller. Put them in the water buckets. Don't let them turn brown." She shoved a bucket and a peeler into my hands. "Don't be slow." The kitchen was a symphony of controlled chaos, clanging pots, hissing grills, and a torrent of Spanish being shouted back and forth. I felt like a ghost, completely out of place. I found my corner and stared at the mountain of potatoes. It seemed impossible. The peeler felt alien in my hand. The first potato I tried to peel looked like I'd attacked it with a lawnmower. I could feel Cynthia's eyes on me from across the room. I could feel the smirks of the other line cooks. They didn't see a potential boss. They saw a joke. A rich girl playing dress-up in their world of sweat and scars. I wanted to cry. I wanted to run out the back door and never look back. I was so far out of my element, I might as well have been on the moon. They ignored me, working around me as if I was just another piece of equipment. I was invisible. And in that moment of profound humiliation, my mother Helen's voice echoed in my mind. The quietest person in the room is often the most powerful. I wasn't here to make friends. I wasn't here to impress them with my charm. I was here to work. My power, for now, was in my silence, in my endurance. So I took a deep breath, picked up another potato, and focused. I watched how the cook next to me held his peeler, the fluid motion of his wrist. I copied him. Slowly, awkwardly at first, then with more confidence. Peel, dice, bucket. Peel, dice, bucket. My shoulders ached. A blister was already forming on my thumb. My designer's brain, used to solving visual problems, started to see it as a puzzle of efficiency. I arranged my station, moving the bucket closer, finding a rhythm. The mountain of potatoes began to shrink. 2 hours later, my back was screaming and my hands were raw, but the last potato cube dropped into the water. I had done it. I looked up, expecting some sign of approval from Cynthia. She just walked over, scooped out a handful of my diced potatoes, and inspected them. She rolled a few cubes in her palm. "Half of these are the wrong size," she said, tossing them back into the bucket. Do the onions next. 50 pounds. Small dice. She kicked a sack of onions toward my feet and walked away without another word. There was no praise. There was no encouragement. There was only the next impossible task. I looked at the sack of onions, and for the first time that morning, I felt a tiny spark of something other than fear. It was defiance. She thought she could break me. Frank Marino thought he could break me. My own father thought I was already broken. They were all about to find out how wrong they were. I dragged the heavy sack to my corner, picked up a knife that felt as heavy as a sword, and got back to work. The stinging in my eyes from the onions was nothing compared to the fire that was starting to burn inside me. The days that followed blurred into a painful, exhausting montage of fire and steel. Each morning, I arrived in that dark, stinking alley before the sun, and each night I stumbled out long after it had set, my body aching in ways I never knew possible. The kitchen was a relentless beast, and I was just a tiny gear in its grinding machinery. Cynthia made sure I never had a moment of rest. After the onions came the fish, 50 pounds of shimmering sea bass that I had to scale, gut, and fillet. The smell clung to me, seeping into my clothes, my hair, my skin. I'd ride the bus home and people would subtly shift away from me. I was marked by the restaurant. On Wednesday, it was cleaning the grease traps, a truly foul task that made my stomach turn. I spent 4 hours on my hands and knees with a scraper and a bucket, the thick, rancid gunk coating my arms. The line cooks snickered as they passed, calling me Princessa. I didn't react. I just kept scraping. I remembered my mother Helen's words again as I worked. The quietest person in the room is often the most powerful. They expected me to complain, to quit. My silence was my weapon. It confused them. It made them uneasy. I wasn't giving them the reaction they wanted. I learned by watching. From my corner, while deveining a mountain of shrimp or scrubbing pots until my knuckles were raw, I observed everything. I saw how the saucier, a wiry man named Marco, moved with an economy of motion, never wasting a step. I saw how Cynthia, for all her harshness, had an almost supernatural ability to know when a sauce was about to break or a piece of meat was perfectly rested. They were a team, speaking a language of nods, grunts, and shouted orders that I was slowly beginning to understand. My clean, quiet apartment became my sanctuary. Every night, I would stand under the hottest shower I could bear for almost an hour, scrubbing away the grime and the smell of the kitchen. I'd treat the cuts and burns on my hands with ointment, my artist's hands now looking like a manual laborer's. I'd fall into bed and sleep a dead, dreamless sleep, only to be jolted awake by my 4:15 a.m. alarm. I didn't have the energy to draw, to even think about art. My world had shrunk to the size of that chaotic kitchen. On Friday afternoon, my 5th day, I was tasked with making the staff meal. It was the ultimate insult, the job for the lowest person on the totem pole. Cynthia threw a box of leftover vegetables and some cheap cuts of beef on a prep table. "Don't poison anyone," was her only instruction. For the first time all week, I felt a flicker of my old self. This was a challenge I understood. It wasn't about brute force. It was about creation. I looked at the ingredients: some wilted chard, bruised tomatoes, tough cuts of chuck steak, onions, and potatoes. It was a sad collection. But I thought about the flavors. I trimmed the beef meticulously, searing it hard to build a deep, rich crust. I caramelized the onions until they were sweet and jammy. I used the potato peels to make a quick, starchy broth to add body to the stew. I didn't have access to the fancy spice rack, so I used salt, pepper, and the deep flavors I had built from the humble ingredients themselves. It was simple, a rustic beef stew, but I poured every ounce of my focus into it. At 4 o'clock, the staff gathered at the long steel table in the back. They served themselves from the large pot, their faces skeptical. They ate in silence, as they always did, too tired for conversation. I didn't eat. I just stood by the dish pit, pretending to be busy, my heart hammering against my ribs. I watched as one of the cooks, a big guy who had been particularly mean to me, went back for a second helping. Then another. No one said a word to me. But as he passed me on his way back to his station, Marco, the saucier, made eye contact for the first time all week. He gave me a short, almost imperceptible nod. It was so small I almost missed it, but it was there. It was a spark of acknowledgement in a week of invisibility. It felt more valuable than any praise my father, Robert, had ever given my sister. Just before my shift ended, Frank Marino appeared. He walked through the kitchen, his presence instantly raising the level of tension. He didn't look at anyone, his eyes scanning every station. He stopped at mine. It was wiped clean, my tools were organized, and a bucket of perfectly minced parsley was ready for service. He picked up a pinch of the parsley, rubbing it between his fingers and sniffing it. "The dish pit needs to be cleared before you leave," he said, his voice flat. He turned to walk away, then paused. "And Claire," he added, without looking at me, "I expect you here at 5 a.m. tomorrow. Saturday is our busiest day." He left. I stood there, my legs feeling weak with relief. Tomorrow was Saturday. He was asking me to come back. I had survived the week. Cynthia was staring at me from across the kitchen, her expression unreadable. I met her gaze and, for the first time, I didn't look away. I wasn't the art project anymore. I was part of the machine. I grabbed an apron and walked toward the mountain of dirty dishes, a small, tired smile on my face. The fight wasn't over, but I had just won the first round. That Saturday was a baptism by fire. The moment I stepped into the kitchen at 5 a.m., the air was thick with a frantic energy that hadn't been there during the week. Orders were already flying. I was put on the vegetable station, a corner piled high with crates of produce. My task was to turn them into perfect, uniform shapes: tournée potatoes, julienne carrots, brunoise shallots. It was tedious, back-breaking work, but it was also precise. It was geometry. It was design. For the first time, the work felt familiar, like holding a fine-tipped pen instead of a sledgehammer. Cynthia watched me like a hawk for the first hour. She'd grab a handful of my cut vegetables, hold them up to the light, and inspect them from every angle. She never said good, but she stopped throwing them out. That was her version of a compliment. I fell into a rhythm, the knife an extension of my hand. My mind went quiet, focused only on the clean lines and sharp edges. I was so absorbed that I barely noticed when Frank Marino entered the kitchen around 7 o'clock, looking pleased. "Table 12 is here," he announced to Cynthia. "Big spenders. Make sure everything is perfect." He smoothed his already perfect suit jacket. "They're friends of my daughter. Lawyers, bankers, our kind of people." From my station, I had a sliver of a view into the dining room through the pass-through window. I saw the hostess lead a couple to the best table in the house, the one in the velvet-lined alcove by the window. My knife stopped mid-slice. My blood ran cold. It was Jessica and Michael. My sister looked radiant in a silk dress, laughing at something Michael whispered in her ear. They looked like they owned the world, sitting in that restaurant that was currently owning me. I felt a hot wave of shame and anger wash over me. I wanted to hide, to become invisible. They were sipping champagne, probably the expensive kind, while I was standing in a hot, loud kitchen, my hands smelling of onions and my back aching. I watched as Frank Marino went to their table, bowing slightly as he greeted them. He shook Michael's hand and kissed Jessica's cheek. "A delight to have you," I could almost hear him say. He praised Jessica's promotion, calling me not built for the real world. "And what would you do in my place? Comment your thoughts and share this story of quiet defiance." Jessica scanned the room with an air of casual ownership. "It's just divine, Frank," she said, her voice carrying into the kitchen during a lull. "We tell everyone about this place. It's a true institution." An institution built on the sweat of people like me, I thought bitterly. I ducked my head, hoping the mountain of carrots in front of me was enough to conceal my identity. They were so close yet so far away, living in a different universe. A universe where work didn't leave you with burns and aching muscles, but with promotions and celebratory dinners. I remembered my mother Helen's words, the ones that had become my mantra this week. The quietest person in the room is often the most powerful. Right then, Jessica was the loudest, her laughter echoing. I was silent, hidden, a ghost in the machine, and I felt anything but powerful. But as their order ticket came through, a new feeling replaced the shame. It was a cold, hard resolve. Their order was complicated, full of dishes with intricate vegetable garnishes. My garnishes, the ones I was cutting. My hands, which had been trembling slightly, became steady. Every cut was suddenly sharper, more precise. I wasn't just dicing vegetables anymore. I was making art. I was crafting a silent message they would never understand. I focused on their plates. The carrots were a perfect thread-like julienne. The zucchini became tiny, translucent pearls. I arranged the microgreens on the plate for the chef not just as a garnish, but as a composition, thinking about color and balance. My work was anonymous, but it was mine, and it was going to be perfect. Marco came by to pick up a pan. He glanced at my prep board, covered in flawlessly cut vegetables. He looked at me, then at the ticket for table 12, then back at me. He seemed to connect the dots. He didn't say anything, but he reached over, took one of my tourné potatoes, and examined it closely. He then placed it back on the board and gave me the same, almost imperceptible nod he had the day before. This time, it felt different. It wasn't just acknowledgement, it was respect. As their main courses were being plated, I watched through the pass. Cynthia herself arranged my vegetables on the plate with unusual care. I saw the plates go out, carried by a waiter to their table. I watched as Jessica looked down at her plate, a small frown of appreciation on her face as she admired the presentation before taking her first bite. She had no idea her failure of a sister was the reason for it. I wiped the sweat from my brow with the back of my arm and grabbed another potato. I had a long night ahead of me, but for the first time, I felt like I was exactly where I needed to be. The weeks that followed blurred into a grueling routine. I lived and breathed the rhythm of the kitchen, the 5 a.m. starts, the searing heat of the stoves, the constant roar of the exhaust fans, and the clatter of pans. My hands, once accustomed to the delicate pressure of a paintbrush, were now calloused and marked with small burns. I was no longer the owner's daughter's sister. I was just Claire, the girl on the vegetable station. I had earned a sliver of grudging respect from the line cooks, not through conversation, but through consistency. My cuts were always perfect. My station was always clean. I never complained. Cynthia still treated me with a cold disdain, but her insults became less frequent. She'd just watch me, her arms crossed, looking for a mistake I never gave her. My silent perfection seemed to irritate her more than any of my initial fumbles. Marco, the saucier, remained my only ally, though our interactions were limited to those brief, affirming nods. Sometimes he'd leave a small cup of his latest experimental sauce on my station without a word. Tasting them was like a secret conversation, a reminder of the artistry that existed even in this chaotic place. One Tuesday, Frank Marino called a full staff meeting, a rare event that sent a ripple of anxiety through the kitchen. He stood before us, looking immaculate as always. "In 2 weeks, we are hosting the annual Mayor's Charity Gala," he announced. "It is the most important night of our year. The most influential people in the city will be here. There is no room for error. I expect absolute perfection." His eyes swept over the room, and for a fraction of a second, they landed on me. From everyone. The 2 weeks leading up to the gala were a frenzy. The menu was complex, ambitious, and every single component had to be made from scratch. I was tasked with an insane amount of prep work. I spent 12 hours a day turning hundreds of pounds of root vegetables into paper-thin, intricate garnishes. I slept for 4 hours a night and dreamt of the sound of my knife hitting the cutting board. My world was the kitchen. I didn't think about my old life, my art, or my family. There was simply no space for it. The night of the gala arrived. The kitchen was hotter and louder than I had ever experienced. It was organized chaos, a symphony of shouting, sizzling, and plating. I was on garnish, the final touch on every plate before it went out. My station was an oasis of calm in the storm. Hundreds of tiny bowls held my work. Carrot spirals, beet chips, radish roses, and herb oils. Around 9 o'clock, in the peak of the dinner rush, one of the waiters burst through the kitchen doors, his face pale. "Mr. Marino, you're needed in the dining room. Table 7, there's been a spill." Frank Marino's face tightened. "What kind of spill?" "Red wine, sir, all over the lady's dress." A collective groan went through the kitchen. A red wine spill on a gala dress was a code red disaster. Frank swore under his breath and rushed out. A few minutes later, he came back looking furious. He was followed by a woman in a white silk gown, now stained with a large, ugly splash of purple. It was Jessica. My heart stopped. She was holding the ruined part of her dress away from her body, her face a mask of theatrical distress. Michael was right behind her, looking apologetic and flustered. "I just can't believe it. This dress is couture," Jessica was saying, her voice high and sharp. "The whole evening is ruined." "We will of course cover the cleaning, and your entire meal is on the house," Frank Marino said, his voice smooth but strained. "Please come this way. We have a staff area where you can try to blot the stain." He led her toward the back, straight toward my part of the kitchen. I froze, trapped behind my station. There was nowhere to go. I wanted the floor to swallow me whole. Jessica was so absorbed in her own drama that she didn't see me at first. She dabbed at the stain with a cloth a busboy gave her, complaining loudly. "It's just hopeless," she sighed. Then she looked up, her eyes scanning the kitchen with disgust, as if noticing the grime for the first time. Her gaze passed over me, then snapped back. Her mouth fell open. "Claire?" she whispered, her voice a mixture of shock and disbelief. "What on earth are you doing here?" The kitchen, which had been a whirlwind of noise, suddenly felt silent. Every cook, every server seemed to have stopped to watch. I could feel Cynthia's smirk from across the room without even looking. I just stood there, in my stained apron, holding a pair of tweezers I'd been using to place microgreens. I couldn't find my voice. "You work here?" Jessica's whisper turned into a sharp, incredulous laugh. "In the kitchen? Oh, this is just priceless." She turned to Michael. "Can you believe this? My sister, the artist, is washing dishes." "I'm on the vegetable station," I said, my voice barely audible. "Vegetables, dishes, what's the difference?" She waved a dismissive hand. She looked me up and down, taking in my sweaty face, my cheap uniform. A cruel smile played on her lips. "Well, I guess everyone finds their level eventually. Dad will be so disappointed." She leaned in as if sharing a secret. "Don't worry, I won't tell anyone. It would be too embarrassing." She turned and walked away, her laughter echoing behind her as Frank Marino led her to a private office. The noise of the kitchen slowly returned, but it sounded different now. It was filled with the whispers and stares of my coworkers. I felt 100 pairs of eyes on me, filled with a mixture of pity and amusement. I looked down at my perfectly arranged garnishes. They suddenly seemed small and pointless. My mother's words came back to me then. The quietest person in the room is often the most powerful. But in that moment, standing in silence while my sister's laughter echoed, I had never felt more powerless in my entire life. I finished my shift in a silent haze. The usual clatter of pans and shouts from the chefs felt miles away, muffled by the ringing in my ears. Every time I looked up, I caught someone's eye and they would quickly look away. Cynthia didn't even try to hide her amusement, humming a cheerful tune as she chopped parsley with unnecessary force. I felt like a ghost in my own body, just going through the motions, my hands plating microgreens while my mind replayed Jessica's cruel, laughing face. The name she used, Claire, felt like a brand on my skin. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a statement. I was so insignificant to her that she couldn't even be bothered to remember my real name. When the last order was sent out, Frank Marino walked over to my station. His face, usually composed and professional, was lined with exhaustion. He avoided looking directly at me. "Emily," he said, his voice low. "About what happened with your sister." I braced myself, expecting to be fired. An employee causing a scene with a high-profile guest, even if I was the victim, was bad for business. "I'm sorry, Mr. Marino," I mumbled, staring at the stainless steel counter. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's not your fault. It's just, this week has been a nightmare." He looked around the magnificent kitchen, but his eyes didn't hold the usual pride. They held a deep, weary sadness. "Look, take tomorrow off, paid. Just clear your head." He walked away before I could respond. His shoulders slumped. It was the first crack I had ever seen in his perfect restaurateur facade. The walk home was a blur. The city lights smeared together, and the sounds of traffic faded into a dull roar. I let myself into my tiny apartment, the one my father called my little artist's box. It was small, but it was mine. Tonight, it felt like a cage. I looked at the graphic design project on my computer screen, a sleek, minimalist logo for a new tech startup. It was good work. I was good at my job. But it felt hollow. What was a clever logo against the weight of my family's disappointment? I sank onto my worn-out sofa, the one I'd found on the curb, and reupholstered myself. The humiliation from the kitchen washed over me again, hot and suffocating. Jessica's words, "Everyone finds their level eventually," echoed in the quiet room. Was this my level? Hiding in a hot kitchen, being mocked by my own sister while she sipped vintage champagne? For years, I had accepted my role as the quiet, artistic disappointment. I'd swallowed the little jabs, the backhanded compliments, the outright dismissals. I just wanted to be left alone to do my work. But tonight was different. Something inside me had snapped. My grandmother Helen had been the only one who saw me. She was a quiet woman too, but she had a spine of steel. She ran a small but successful bakery for 40 years. She always used to tell me, "People underestimate a quiet garden, but that's where the strongest roots grow." After she passed, she left me a small inheritance, which I used for the down payment on this apartment, and a heavy cedar box filled with her personal things. On impulse, I pulled the box out from under my bed. The smell of cedar and old paper filled the air. I ran my fingers over her old recipe cards, her reading glasses, a bundle of letters. At the very bottom, tucked under a faded photograph of her and my grandfather, was a thick manila envelope I'd never paid much attention to. I always assumed it was just old tax documents. I pulled it out. My name, Emily, was written on the front in her elegant, looping handwriting. Inside was a stack of papers held together by a rusty paperclip. It was a property deed. A small, commercially zoned plot of land on the outskirts of the city, in a rundown industrial area nobody ever went to. She had bought it for next to nothing decades ago. The deed was accompanied by a handwritten note. "My dearest Emily," it read, "this little piece of dirt probably isn't worth much now. But I always believed in buying the things nobody else sees value in yet. Sometimes the most forgotten places have the most potential. Just like people." I stared at the address on the deed. I knew the area. It was desolate, filled with abandoned warehouses and overgrown lots. Worthless, just like my grandmother said. I felt a fresh wave of despair, a useless plot of land. It felt like a metaphor for my life. But then, I stopped. The startup I was designing the logo for. I remembered a conversation I'd overheard with the CEO. They were complaining about the astronomical real estate prices downtown. They were looking for a location for their new, massive corporate campus. They wanted something with character, something they could build from the ground up, in an up-and-coming area they could brand as their own. I remembered him mentioning a specific district the city was planning to redevelop, offering huge tax incentives to the first major company that moved in. My hands started to shake. I scrambled for my laptop, my heart hammering against my ribs. I pulled up the City Planning Commission's website, my fingers flying across the keyboard. I found the redevelopment zone map. I traced the boundaries with my finger on the screen, then looked back at the address on the deed in my hand. It was a perfect match. My grandmother's forgotten, worthless piece of dirt was sitting right in the middle of the city's next big tech hub. It wasn't just not worthless. To the right buyer, it was a gold mine. Suddenly, I wasn't thinking about Jessica's laughter or my father's disappointment. I was thinking about Frank Marino's exhausted face. I was thinking about a restaurant with a for sale sign in the window. My grandmother's words echoed in my mind. People underestimate a quiet garden, but that's where the strongest roots grow. And I finally understood. My roots were about to break through the concrete. The next morning, I didn't wake up to the familiar feeling of dread. I woke up with a purpose so clear and sharp it felt like a physical object in my hands. I made coffee, my movements precise and deliberate. I looked at the logo on my computer screen, the one for the tech startup, and a slow smile spread across my face. They wanted to build a campus. I was going to sell them the ground to do it on. My first call was to a man named Richard, a commercial real estate lawyer whose name was at the top of every list for best in the city. Getting an appointment was supposed to take weeks, but when I mentioned the specific plot address and the redevelopment zone, His secretary put me on hold for 10 seconds before telling me he could see me in an hour. His office was on the 50th floor of a glass tower downtown, the kind of place my sister Jessica would describe in detail to make her friends jealous. Richard was an older man with sharp eyes and a suit that probably cost more than my car. He looked at me, then at the worn manila envelope I placed on his vast mahogany desk, with polite skepticism. He slid the deed out and examined it. "This has been in your family a while," he noted, his tone flat. I just nodded. He typed the address into his computer, his fingers moving quickly. He pulled up the city zoning maps. I watched his eyebrows climb his forehead. He leaned closer to the screen, then looked back at the deed, then back at the screen. The skepticism in his eyes was replaced by something else. Pure, unadulterated shock. "Miss," he said, his voice now laced with respect. "Do you have any idea what you're holding?" "I have a pretty good idea," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "A good idea?" He let out a short, breathless laugh. "This isn't a piece of dirt. This is the key to the entire district, the anchor plot. Without this, the city's plan stalls. Any company wanting to build there, they have to go through you." He leaned back in his chair, looking at me as if seeing me for the first time. "To the right buyer, this land isn't just valuable. It's essential. We could be talking 8 figures, maybe more." 8 figures. The number hung in the air, shimmering. I felt a wave of dizziness, but I anchored myself to the image of my father's dismissive face. "There is a right buyer," I told Richard, "and I already know who they are." 2 hours later, I was back in my small apartment, the city stretching out below Richard's window, now feeling like it was mine for the taking. I drafted an email to Blake, the CEO of the startup. My previous emails to him were all about font choices and color palettes. This one was different. It was short and direct. I introduced myself as the owner of the property at the center of the redevelopment zone. I noted that I was aware of his company's interest in the area. I proposed a meeting to discuss a potential sale. I signed it with my full name, Emily, and my phone number. I hit send before I could lose my nerve. His reply came in under 5 minutes. "Absolutely. Can you meet tomorrow at 10 a.m.? The next day, I walked into the startup's trendy, open-plan office. Blake, a man my age with boundless energy and a hoodie that probably cost $500, came out to greet me. He recognized me immediately. "Emily, great to see you. Did you have some new logo mock-ups for us?" I shook my head, offering a small smile. "No, Blake. I'm not here today as your graphic designer." His friendly expression shifted to one of confusion. "Oh? Okay. I'm here as the owner of the land you want to build your new headquarters on." The silence that followed was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. Blake's mouth opened slightly. He stared at me, connecting the dots. The freelance designer he'd been paying a few $1,000s was the person holding the key to his $100 million project. I saw the exact moment respect dawned in his eyes. It was a look I had never once received from my own father. "Well," he said finally, a slow grin spreading across his face, "I guess we should talk." We sat in a glass-walled conference room. I laid out my terms, the numbers Richard and I had discussed. I spoke calmly, professionally, as if I'd been cutting multi-million-dollar deals my whole life. Blake didn't haggle much. He knew the strategic value. He knew what it would cost in time and money to try and find an alternative. There was no alternative. My grandmother, with her quiet wisdom, had bought the only piece that mattered. We shook hands on a number that made my knees feel weak. "Our lawyers will be in touch with your lawyer to finalize the paperwork," he said, his voice full of genuine admiration. I have to say, Emily, that was impressive. I walked out of that building and onto the busy street, the city noise sounding like applause. I felt taller. The weight of years of being the lesser daughter, the artistic disappointment, had vanished. I walked for blocks until I found myself standing across the street from the Gilded Spoon. But the for sale sign was still in the window, looking like a sad, forgotten flag. I looked at the elegant restaurant, the place of my deepest humiliation. Frank Marino's tired face flashed in my mind. Then my grandmother's words, clear as a bell. People underestimate a quiet garden, but that's where the strongest roots grow. My roots had been growing in the dark for years, and they had just broken through the concrete, stronger than anyone could have ever imagined. I pulled out my phone and dialed Richard's number. "The deal is done," I said. "Now, I need you to do something else for me. I want to buy a restaurant." Richard didn't waste a second. He was an older, sharp-as-a-tack lawyer who had worked for my grandmother for 30 years, and I think he saw this as fulfilling a final request from an old friend. He drew up the offer that same afternoon. It was all cash, significantly above the asking price, with a clause that we would close in 5 business days. It was an offer designed to be irresistible. The next day, I met Frank Marino at the restaurant. It was closed for the afternoon, and the dining room felt cavernous and sad without the clinking of glasses and quiet chatter. Frank looked even more tired than I remembered, the lines around his eyes deeper. He held my offer in his hand, his fingers tracing the bolded number at the bottom of the page. "This is very generous, Miss Emily," he said, his voice raspy. "More than generous." "I want the staff to stay on if they choose," I told him, my voice even. "And I'd like you to stay on as a consultant for the first month, fully paid, to ensure a smooth transition. Your name is part of this place." He looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of life in his eyes. It wasn't just about the money. It was about his legacy. He thought I was just another investor looking to flip a property, but my offer showed I respected what he had built. He had no idea that my motives were far more personal. He nodded slowly. "I think we can do that," he said, extending a hand. "Welcome to the Gilded Spoon." We shook on it, and just like that, the site of my greatest humiliation was mine. For the next few days, Richard's office and the bank were a blur of paperwork. Wires were sent, deeds were transferred, and keys were made. On Friday morning, Richard called me. "It's done, Emily. You are officially a restaurateur." I hung up the phone and just sat in silence in my tiny apartment, a set of shiny new keys on my coffee table. The keys didn't just open a restaurant, they unlocked the final stage of my plan. That evening, I picked up my phone and dialed my father's number. He answered on the second ring, his voice impatient. "Emily, everything all right?" He always assumed my calls were about some minor crisis. "Everything is wonderful, Dad," I said, injecting a bright, cheerful tone into my voice. "In fact, I have some amazing news. My career has taken a really exciting turn, and I wanted to celebrate with the family. My treat." There was a pause. I could practically hear him processing it. My hobby, producing enough money to treat them all to dinner? Impossible. "Oh," he said, his tone softening into one of patronizing curiosity. "That's nice, dear. What kind of turn?" "I'll tell you all about it at dinner," I said smoothly. "Are you, Jessica, and Michael free next Saturday, say 8 o'clock? "I believe so. Where were you thinking of going?" he asked. I smiled. This was the moment. "I made a reservation at the Gilded Spoon." Another pause. This one longer. "The Gilded Spoon?" He sounded genuinely surprised. "That's quite expensive, Emily. Are you sure you can—" "Don't worry about it, Dad. It's all taken care of. I really want to do this for you all, to thank you for your support." The lie felt slick and easy on my tongue. "Just be there Saturday at 8, table for 4. "Well, all right then," he said, still sounding bewildered. "We'll be there. We're very proud of you, Emily." I ended the call, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was done. The trap was set. They would walk in expecting to pat their little girl on the head for finally making a few dollars. They would be condescending and smug, sitting at the same table, ready to deliver another round of backhanded compliments. They had no idea they weren't guests. They were the main event. That Saturday, I arrived at the restaurant hours before it opened. I walked through the empty dining room, the silence humming with potential. I stopped at the very table where my father had raised his glass to Jessica, the place where I had felt so small and invisible. I ran my hand over the smooth, dark wood. My grandmother's words echoed in my mind, not as a memory, but as a prophecy fulfilled. People underestimate a quiet garden, but that's where the strongest roots grow. My roots now owned the very ground they had tried to bury me in. And tonight, they were going to see just how far those roots had spread. They arrived at precisely 8 o'clock, a synchronized trio of condescension. Jessica was wearing a silk dress that probably cost more than my first car, and Michael had his arm draped around her as if presenting a trophy. My father, Robert, walked in first, scanning the room with the air of a man who owned it, even though he was just a frequent customer. He spotted me at our old table and gave a tight, patronizing smile. "Emily, dear," he said, sitting down. "You look, well, this is a lovely gesture." "It certainly is a surprise," Jessica added, her eyes sweeping over me, cataloging my simple black dress, my lack of expensive jewelry. "We're all dying to hear about this big career move." Michael just nodded, a smug smirk playing on his lips. "Yes, let's hear how the other half lives." I smiled, a genuine, calm smile that felt utterly foreign and powerful on my face. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I flagged down a waiter and ordered a bottle of their best champagne. Not the cheap Prosecco, the vintage kind. When it arrived, I made sure everyone had a full glass before I raised my own. "First, a toast," I said, my voice clear and steady. It didn't waver. "To family, and to getting exactly what you deserve." They drank, oblivious. The irony was so thick I could taste it along with the champagne. "All right, Emily, enough suspense," Robert said, setting his glass down. "What's the big news? Did you finally get a full-time job with benefits?" I took a slow sip of my champagne, letting the silence stretch. Then I placed my glass on the table and folded my hands. "In a way," I said. "But first, I'd like you to meet someone." I caught the eye of the manager, who gave a slight nod. A moment later, a man in a crisp white chef's coat emerged from the kitchen. He was Paul, the renowned head chef of the Gilded Spoon, a man my father had tried to schmooze for years to get preferential reservations. Paul walked directly to our table. My father's face lit up, preparing to greet him like an old friend, but Paul's eyes were on me. "Ms. Emily," he said, his voice filled with professional respect. "Is everything to your satisfaction this evening?" I watched the confusion ripple across their faces. Robert's smile froze. Jessica's eyes narrowed. Michael's smirk vanished. "Everything is perfect, Paul." "Thank you for asking," I replied warmly. "I just wanted to introduce you to my family." Paul nodded politely at them, then turned back to me. "The new menus are ready for your review tomorrow morning if that's convenient." 10 a.m. sounds perfect, I said. He nodded once more and returned to his kitchen. Silence. The clinking of silverware from other tables sounded like thunder. Jessica was the first to speak, her voice a venomous whisper. "What was that? What is going on, Emily?" I reached into my purse and took out the set of shiny new keys. I placed them on the center of the table. They made a soft, definitive click against the dark wood. "That," I said, looking at my father, "was my new head chef. And this," I gestured to the room, "is my new restaurant." The color drained from Robert's face. He stared at the keys, then at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. You what? That's impossible. You don't have that kind of money. This is a joke." "It's not a joke," I said calmly. "My artistic hobby was a lot more profitable than you ever cared to ask. I built a global client base while you were toasting Jessica's promotions. I saved every penny, and when I found out this place was for sale, well, it seemed like the perfect investment." "This is pathetic," Jessica hissed, her composure finally cracking. "A pathetic cry for attention. You bought a restaurant just to spite us?" "No, Jessica," I said, my voice hardening slightly. "I bought it for me. I bought it because I'm good at what I do. You were right, Dad. I'm not built for your real world of backstabbing and corporate ladders. I'm a builder. I built a career from nothing, and now I've built this." I leaned forward, my eyes locked on my father. "At this very table, you toasted to your successful daughter and looked at me with pity. You never once saw me. You saw a failure, a disappointment. You underestimated me." I picked up my champagne glass again. My grandmother Helen always told me, "People underestimate a quiet garden, but that's where the strongest roots grow." You were so busy celebrating your prize rose, you never bothered to look down. You never saw my roots spreading under this entire property. I then turned my gaze to Michael. "And as the new owner, I've been reviewing the books, the vendors, the reservation lists. It's amazing what you learn about the city's most powerful people, who they have lunch with, what they talk about." I let the words hang in the air. I've heard whispers about certain investment schemes, the kind of creative accounting that could make a senior partner at a law firm, say, your fiancé, very, very vulnerable. It could ruin a career. Jessica stared at Michael, a flicker of pure panic in her eyes. The marble statue was cracking. I stood up, placing my napkin on the table. The meal is on the house. Consider it my final gift to the family. After tonight, none of you are welcome here again. I looked at the manager, who was waiting discreetly nearby. Please show my guests out. They were escorted out, speechless and humiliated, past the staring eyes of the city's elite. I didn't watch them go. I stood by the window, looking out at the city lights. The anger, the hurt, the years of feeling invisible. It was all gone. It hadn't been washed away by revenge, but by accomplishment. I turned back to the now empty dining room. It wasn't a weapon anymore. It was my future. My quiet, strong, beautiful garden. And it was finally time for me to bloom. From invisible graphic designer to owner, I made them leave in shame. My quiet garden blooms now. What did you think of my triumph? Subscribe for more intense stories of revenge.